We are less than a month away from COP27, the World Conference on Climate Change, set to take place in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. What are the main topics expected to be discussed, and what's been achieved following last year's COP in Glasgow? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. A little history for you. It started in 1995 in Berlin. The Conference of the Parties, or COP, their annual conferences to discuss and negotiate climate change policies, strategies, and vision for the future. And they're becoming more and more important as scientists tell us the window of time available to take meaningful climate action is closing, and closing quickly. Earlier, I spoke with Inger Anderson, the executive director of the United Nations Environment Program. She started the interview by pointing out that mankind has been able to change and adapt in the past, and that the world needs to do it again.
I think the fact that in the 70s, scientists saw that we were literally creating a hole in the sky, right? We were creating a hole in the ozone layer, and we were doing that by some of the chemicals we were using, HCFCs and CFCs, but that gets lost in the chemicals we use for cooling, for spray cans, for foams, and so on. And the world decided to put together a convention, the Vienna Convention, and a protocol underneath that, the Montreal Protocol, to phase out these chemicals. And today, 99% of these chemicals are phased out. You have different chemicals in your refrigerator or in your air conditioner, in your spray can. That does not degrade the ozone layer, and the ozone layer on both sides of the poles is healing. That's an amazing success, because it meant every refrigerator and every hairspray back in the 60s or whatever, or every spray can, had to use a different gas. It was a massive undertaking by an entire industry. And similarly, lead in petrol. Look, we added it because we thought it gave our engine more oomph. Didn't really, but it did poison our children. And it did have very negative environmental impacts. And last year, the last liter of leaded petrol was pumped in the last country. And now we have no lead in petrol. So we know that we can, when we work together across the family of nations, 193, saying this thing is bad for us, we know we can do it. It's that spirit we need to find for climate and for biodiversity.
So the lessons there, because I think, you know, when we look at climate change and we look at, and believe me, you know it in its totality, and it's not just one small focused thing, it's a lot. We tend to think it's so dire, and yet there are lessons from this, right?
There absolutely are, and I think the beauty is that we are living in this world where all information is available to everyone. And so we need to roll out more aggressively renewable energy. We need to roll out more aggressively the financing for that renewable energy to those who cannot afford it, because there's still many nations that live in energy poverty, where not 100% of people have access. And it's critical that these countries can serve their people in the same way that other countries can. But they need to do it with renewables. And so we need to have payments, financing, investments going to these countries so that they can get that. We need to have innovation, and it's happening. We just need to accelerate it on e-mobility, electric mobility, the way to go, non-emission based. Of course, we need some other elements to create the batteries, etc., for these vehicles, but we can do that. Human beings are incredibly clever and smart. The issue is now that we're not doing it fast enough. And so those shifts that we need to see in the economy, where we decarbonize, where we do not use coal, oil, and gas with the same amount of intensity, where we understand that we need to level off, we have to accelerate that. Right now, with the conditional NDCs, these promissory notes that countries gave, they said we are going to reduce our emissions by X. When we add that up, we come to 2.7 degrees at 2100. And when we then take on board the net zero pledges, others have said we will arrive at net zero, we come to 2.1 degrees. Today, we live at 1.2, 1.3 degrees, and we're already seeing wildfires, floods, inundations, and droughts and catastrophes. Think of Pakistan. So we need to move much faster and with much greater acceleration.
You know, it's so funny you talk about the aerosols, and we don't see those, and the lead, no one's pumping that any longer. But we think about coal, and we think about fossil fuels, and they've just kind of the fiber of a lot of economies, and getting that shift in place. Saying, look, we've got to, it's not as easy as turning a light switch off.
It is not.
Making that change, that shift, seems to take time. It needs to be accelerated. What can be done there, and what's your message to businesses where there seems to be this intransigence? Well, we're moving as fast as we can.
And some businesses, indeed, they are, and more power to them for doing that. So we really want I really want to underline that. But look, I mean, we can accelerate things also by government incentives, also by government regulations. And if we accelerate investments in renewables, well, that's part of the solution, and it'll be good. It's a new climate economy, as we well know, a new opportunity. It's important that we understand that folks who work in coal mines not be left behind, and there's a reason why in this country where we happen to be sitting right now in the United States at the General Assembly, while some states don't want to give this up and while there's strong interest. And we have to understand that. That's legitimate in that these families and these communities are dependent on these industries. So what are we going to do to ensure that we do not, quote unquote, leave anyone behind? Government has to do a degree of enticing new industries to those areas. We have to have incentives in place so that these industries can accelerate. It's not easy, but on a good windy day in my own country, Denmark, we are entirely relying on wind. On a less windy day, we import from Sweden that is generated otherwise. But I think as one begins to invest in renewable, it also takes on a momentum of its own. I live in Kenya, and Kenya invested 30 years ago in geothermal. They sit on the Great African Rift. They have amazing geothermal potential. The heat of the earth can be simply boiling and thus drive generators and create power. That's there, and of course, we've seen what Morocco has done on concentrated solar, what Saudi Arabia is doing on solar. There are real opportunities here, and opportunities that we cannot miss.
You have seen success in the past where you have an insurmountable
Absolutely.
issue, and it was overcome. So
absolutely, and today, you know, renewable energy is very cheap. It's in many places competitive with coal. You know, the price of concentrated solar, the price of PV, the price of wind, which used to be more expensive because there was less of it and a lot of innovation, R&D had to be done. But now it's actually competitive. And so when you're seeing in Kenya, for example, there's a company called Mkopa. They give a small loan, $1,000. People are not, you know, this is a poor country. And you take that loan over a 10-year period, and you get a couple of panels installed on your roof. And you pay the equivalency of what would have been your electric bill. And bingo, you have solar power. You have power. Your kids can do their homework after dark. You can have food keep in your refrigerator. We can get there, poor and rich. We just need to put our minds to it.
My conversation with Inger Andersen there. To continue our discussion on climate change, let's bring in our panel. Changhua Wu is CEO of Beijing Future Innovation Center. She's joining us from Arlington, Virginia. From Phoenix, Arizona, Michael Dorsey is a member of the Club of Rome. That's an organization of intellectuals and business leaders who discuss pressing global issues. And Sergio Margulis is a consultant at the International Institute for Sustainability. He's joining us from Rio de Janeiro. Michael, let me start with you. I mean, we know COP27 is just around the corner, and we know the drill, don't we? I mean, there's always meetings, there's speeches, and then it seems like it comes down to the wire. Are they going to get a deal or are they not going to get a deal? We know that the Glasgow Climate Pact was signed. The Paris Agreement rule book was also delivered. But a year later, what does that actually mean?
You know, we're on a course to deliver on sustainability in a big, big way. We're on a course to transition to renewable energy. We're on a course to tackle the growing and increasing pollution problem. We're on a course to hopefully begin the big, long climb to save biodiversity. And really the United Nations process, the one on climate, but also on biodiversity and other issues, that is the place in which moves the world forward, moves all the countries of the world forward to tackle these problems. And hopefully we're going to see success as we come in and go out of this next conference on climate change. But really, it's so important. The UN process is critical because it assembles all the world's countries to move forward on these issues. And though some criticize it, the UN process on climate has been doing just that. That's why we see the explosive growth of renewable energy. That's why we see now in the 2022 and going forward, the cheapest way to generate electricity is with renewable power.
So, Sergio, a positive take there from Michael, and much the same from Inger, I would say. One of the things that we saw after Glasgow was 100 countries, more than 100 actually, signed on to this ambitious agreement to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. That's obviously a concern there in Brazil. What are we seeing there? Is this something that can be measurable? Are we seeing progress?
Well, thank you for the call. Well, I believe I'm a little less optimistic than my colleagues before. The call for urgent action is proceeding at a much slower pace than I think that the planet deserves. The forest part of the climate change, even though it's smaller part compared to the energy, still it's a very important issue. It's a major contributor. And what we are seeing currently in Brazil is actually going towards the other direction. This is temporary, we hope, but the current government, for example, it's simply denying that deforestation is increasing at alarming rates, and thus the emissions are increasing at alarming rates. So not all the fronts we're seeing and hearing good progress, but in some, and countries are independent and sovereign to decide their own internal policies, whether or not they have signed to the global agreements. But progress has not been as good and optimistic as we wish.
And Sergio, of course, the Amazon's been referred to as the lungs of the world. As you say, deforestation's been a real issue there. Give me an idea of, the conversations that take place in Brazil, the amount of concern about this.
Well, as you all probably know, we have an election. We had just the first round of elections, and we're going to have the second round in a couple of weeks. And this is one of the central issues in the debate between the two candidates. He had, since he first was assigned in government 4 years ago, he has always promised that the environment was not a priority. He denied climate change. He said he would never increase and demarcate Indian lands. Conservation of the biodiversity was absolutely not a priority in his policies. And he has just been doing this. He's fulfilling his promises. So there's no surprise here. Of course, we hear worldwide, the world astonished by Mr. Bolsonaro's declarations, even worse, his actions. And we have a poll now in a couple of weeks to hopefully reverse the current trends. It's a major issue, and the country is very much concerned with the Amazon fate.
Changhua, let me ask about that. He's saying it's a major issue in the campaign in Brazil. We've got an election here in the United States about 20 some odd days away. We still don't see this as an issue that's really resonating. And I was at a conference earlier this year where one of the speakers said, look, we've got to get climate change as one of the major issues one of the topics that people talk about in every campaign because this is a threat. And yet it seems as though, people are talking about the economy or abortion rights, that sort of thing. Are you concerned about the fact that it still hasn't resonated as an issue?
Definitely. I'm very, very concerned as an environmentalist, as a person totally dedicated my professional life to fight climate change. And we just seem to be stuck in many, many other priorities there. Even though we talk about it, we even use like a climate correct, that sort of a narrative to really drive the agenda. But in the reality, if you look at energy prices, look at the food prices, that's the reality. And the inflation there as well. And now with the geopolitical disruption, supply chain security and reshaping has become another major constraining factors in terms of how quickly we'll be able to really deliver all the renewable clean energy transition goals there. So generally speaking, I'm very concerned, but hopefully somehow this will be sort of temporary. I don't know how temporary that'll be, depending on many, many factors there. But globally, there seems to be a united theme around by 2030, we need to about half, reduce 50% of the emissions there in order to really deliver the carbon neutrality by mid of century. And so we literally have about barely 8 years to go. And with all the complexities here, with all the complications here, I doubt it very much at this moment that we'll be able to deliver the goals or commitments committed by both the developed countries and developing countries there. Looking into actually COP27, we probably all aware loss and damages will be a major issue. Why? Because we are living in climate change, which is intensifying. And the countries in North America, in Europe, in China, in Africa, in Latin America and Pakistan there as well as another typical example. And people have to bear the losses and the damages there. And global community is put at the front point basically to figure out how to address the loss and the damage issues at COP27. I think that's going to be a major, major debate as well.
Yeah, Michael, she mentioned Pakistan. It's interesting because we know a lot about borders. They separate countries. We also know that climate change completely ignores borders. I was just in Greenland a few months back, and there they say, what happens in Greenland doesn't stay in Greenland. The icebergs melt. It's impacting places around the world. And we heard a lot of that at the UN General Assembly. We have some sound from speakers from both Pakistan and the Philippines kind of addressing this. I want to listen to what they have to say, and I want to get your reaction on the other side. Let's listen.
Pakistan has never seen a more stark and devastating example of the impact of global warming. Nature has unleashed her fury on Pakistan without looking at our carbon footprint, which is next to nothing.
The effects of climate change are uneven and reflect an historical injustice. Those who are least responsible suffer the most. The Philippines, for example, is a net carbon sink. We absorb more carbon dioxide than we emit. And yet, we are the fourth most vulnerable country to the effects of climate change.
Michael, I saw you nodding your head. Give me your thoughts on these comments.
Well, first, it's absolutely true that those on the margins of the world, and even within countries for that matter, the poorest of the poor amongst us, as well as in other countries, they absolutely do contribute the least to climate change and other forms of pollution as well. But they do indeed suffer disproportionately more. They bear the brunt of the climate catastrophe as it is unfolding upon them. They bear the brunt from floods, from heat waves, and so forth. They bear the brunt of loss of life. So this is an absolute fact, not just for countries in the global south, as it were, but also even within the United States. Those citizens in the U.S., for example, that are the poorest of the poor, they lose their lives first and foremost. They have nowhere to go because sometimes they don't even own a vehicle to leave areas that are going to be subject to rising water, whether it's from hurricanes, whether it's fires, from forest fires, and so forth. So that's an absolute fact, and we've got to commit more resources, and the we in this case is the wealthy amongst us, the wealthier nations. We've got to assemble resources for the poor nations and get those resources to them quickly. It's absolutely the case, and no one should think otherwise, that the UN process isn't necessarily moving the monies at the size that they need to be moved, nor at the speed. And we've got to actually accelerate that, both the speed that we move resources to people on the margins, as well as the amount of resources that we move to them, because they absolutely need these things. So that's an absolute fact, and we've got to work on that. We've got to put much more energy into delivering for those on the margins, for sure.
Sergio, I want to get your thoughts on this too, because it seems in some respects it's developed nations kind of pitted against developing nations. You know, a lot of these developing nations look at places like the U.S. and Europe, and here are places where, you know, they had industrial revolutions, a lot of benefits economically, but then the pollution, and then they're looking at these other countries and saying, well, don't follow our pathway. You got to go a different way, kind of dictating how to do things. Can you talk about this friction, this dynamic?
Yes, there are. In fact, we're touching here on a critical issue about climate change, which is the mitigation and the adaptation. At the same time that countries need to mitigate their emissions, means they have to change their energy policies and in order not to emit so much CO2. But at the same time, they need to spend money to adapt to climate change. The rich nations, they are more adapted. A classic good example is the Netherlands, Holland, which is a low-lying country, is a country on average below sea level, but nobody's really concerned about the impacts of climate change in Holland, because Holland is already prepared to deal with the increasing sea levels. While Bangladesh, who is an extremely poor country and is also a low-lying country, we're very concerned about Bangladesh, because Bangladesh doesn't have the means to protect the current levels of sea level rise when they have short variations, let alone when we will see major increases in sea level rise. So the poor nations, they have to spend most of their resources in adapting to climate change, as opposed to lowering their emissions, which are responsibility from the richer nations. And so the richer nations have to both help the countries adapt to climate change and reduce their own emissions. So the effort is gigantic.
Changhua, in my interview with Inger Anderson, she talked about helping to finance green projects and sustainable sources of energy in some of these developing countries. But the senior climate negotiator for the Democratic Republic of Congo had some rather strong words about all of this. Let's listen to what he had to say.
From 2025 onwards, we will have to come up with a new figure. And developing countries and Africans no longer want it to be just a political figure, a round figure like the 100 billion that Hillary Clinton launched in 2009 in Copenhagen, but a figure that truly reflects the needs of developing countries.
You know, when he says political figure, you get the sense that these are just numbers being bandied about. What's really happening on the ground?
On the ground, from developed region, countries' perspective, they have never honored their commitment to the level they promised, particularly around this $100 billion actually per year, which was supposed to be delivered by 2020, which is still not delivered yet. So current global effort is to really deliver, hopefully somehow to get that delivered before 2025. So fingers crossed. In the meantime, we're talking about adaptation, so we require more financial resources from developed countries in particular to support the poorest countries in the world to adapt, to become more resilient to climate change. And the numbers, I think, on the table playing around is about to double by 2030 to about $40 billion. So again, fingers crossed, I don't know where that's going to come from, who will be able to really put the cash or money on the table to deliver that. In the meantime, the narrative is more like also bringing more private sectors into that landscape. But somehow it's very complicated, particularly at this moment, because of the energy crisis, because of the COVID, with all the disruptions there, it's very, very difficult actually for private sectors to seriously put their money into that process. A couple of other points I want to add, bring China into that landscape. Firstly, China experienced the worst ever extreme heat waves and a drought this summer. And I think their estimates basically saying that's the most costly in ever human record actually so far. That's devastating. China is an emerging economy. On one side, it definitely compared to poorest countries, China probably has a little bit more capability, but generally speaking, we're still not there yet. So we are not be able to beat the nature. On the positive side, China definitely, through its 14th five-year plan, pretty much by the spring, China has managed actually to align all the major economy, industry, sector, finance, policy, you name it, actually aligned with China's, we call it a dual carbon commitments to deliver capping emissions before 2030 and carbon neutrality before 2060. That's definitely a major, major positive sign of hope at this moment. But somehow, unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the disruption of geopolitics is really disrupting the global supply chain and slowing the process. Without collaboration, I doubt it very much we'll be able to deliver the goal we said we're going to deliver.
And speaking of that, Michael, she kind of set the stage. I mean, there's so much going on globally right now, and geopolitics always involved in so much. As you look at COP27, what are going to be some of the headlines you're looking for? What are your expectations?
Well, I'll say two things on it. First, the direct answer to the question. We hope we're going to see more resources, more money go to those poorest nations around the world that desperately need this, simply to respond to the catastrophes that they've seen over the past year. So that, we hope, is going to happen at this COP, or really get teed up for the next series of climate negotiations. The other thing, though, is that many countries around the world, and I think China is a good example of this, many emerging economies and even some poorer countries are not waiting around to see monies that have been promised year on year that have not materialized. You know who's the largest developer and deployer of solar energy on Earth? It's not the United States, it's actually China. And they are outpacing the U.S. by almost 200% in just installed capacity in the past year. So there are certain challenges that emerging market economies face and poor countries do face, but many aren't waiting around to get out ahead of this. And why are they not waiting around? Because it just so happens that solar energy, wind in particular, renewable energy in general, is cheaper. It's the cheapest way to generate power. So some of these countries are tuning into this fact and surging ahead. And I think we're going to see more of that, independent of whether we see monies go to those countries or not. Folks aren't waiting around, because this is now the stuff that is accretive. This is the stuff that contributes to the bottom line, to GNP, to improving wellness, to improving well-being. Renewable sustainability, that's going to save the day.
All right, we're going to leave it with that. Thank you all for joining us. A great discussion. Really appreciate it. That's it for this edition of The Heat. The conversation, though, continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for joining us.
The nature of